Yeah, Rabbi say so. This Shabbos we're going to be laning, hopefully also learning two parshas, Acharei Mois and Kedoshim. As we all know, this happens because in a Shana Pshuta, when there's only one Adar, we don't have enough Shabbosos to lane the 53 or 54 parshas that we have in the Torah, and therefore we combine some of the parshas and lane parshas mechubaros in order that we should be going with the Torah in the year. So there doesn't really have to be a reason. There doesn't really have to be an intrinsic connection between the two parshas that we connect with each other. There are also other factors that play into this because, let's say, Bamidbar always needs to be read, or at least Bamidbar, and sometimes Bamidbar and Nosoi before Shavuos. They all kind of cheshbonis in why we are mechaber certain parshas. But nevertheless, that the Maharal says that Dvorim Gedolim Einam B'mikre. Great things don't happen by chance, and Avada, the fact that Yidden are mechaber certain parshas together, and specifically those parshas, probably has a meaning. So I want to suggest that there is a connection between Acharei, Moshe, and Kedoshim. In the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, the Ramban goes into a long explanation of what the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihiyu is. And he says that it's coming to teach us that one should not be a novel b'reshus haTorah, meaning that a person could be mekayim all the mitzvahs asay and refrain from all the negative prohibitions, and nevertheless he could miss the spirit of Torah. He eats only kosher food, but he indulges in gashmias. He could be metaltal in a reshus hayochid, all kind of kalim that are mutter betiltal, but he's busy a whole Shabbos doing work, and he's missing the spirit of Shabbos. And that the Ramban calls a novel b'reshus haTorah. It's all b'reshus haTorah. It's all permitted. It's all within the boundaries of halacha, but nevertheless, he's a novel. One can be observant and not religious. And that's the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu. It's coming to tell us that the goal of all the mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs lois aseh is that we should live a life of Kedusha, which is a lotion of hazmona, of yichud. We should have a single-minded dedication to the Rebbeinu Shalom, commitment. That's what Kedusha is about. As we say, Vani zois berisi oisam ama Hashem ruchi asher olecho. Udvorai asher samti beficho lo yomushu mipicho mipizaracho mipizarach adolam. So you see, there's ruchi asher olecho and dvorai asher samti beficho. There's the dvorai asher samti beficho is not enough. That's the letter of the law. There has to be also ruchi asher olecho, which is the spirit of the law, and that's what Kedoshim Tiyu is about. Now, Parshas Acharei begins with Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Acharei Mois. Shnei b'nei Aharon b'kirvasam l'fnei Hashem vayomusu. And therefore comes the tzivui, v'al yavoi b'chol eis el hakodesh. So, in Pshuta Shel Mikra, as it says in Parashat Shmini, the sin of the bnei Aharon was that they were makriv eish zora asher lo yitziva Hashem. And over here it appears in the words, b'kirvasam l'fnei Hashem. In other words, they did what they did in order to come closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. There's a very touching Orach Chaim HaKodesh in the beginning of this week's parsha, where he says on these words, "B'karvasim lefnei Hashem, Diber Hashem leMoshe derech misosam." How did Nadav Avihu die? Shehoisa al zeh haderech b'karvasim lefnei Hashem. Pirush sheniskarvu lefnei Or HaElyon b'chibas HaKodesh. Their neshama passed out in dveikus to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Chibas hakodesh ubazeh meisu, v'hu soid hanashika. It's the highest level of death. Misas nashika. Sheba meisim atzadikim. V'hine heim shavim lemisas kol atzadikim. Elo sha'hefresh hu sha'tzadikim anashikim eskareves lahem v'ilu heim neskarvu lo. V'hu oimram b'karvasim lefnei Hashem v'oimri vayomusu. Ramas hafloas chibas hatzadikim, that it was as a afterthought they died, so to speak. That they didn't even experience death, and even though they were dying, loy nimnu mikroiv ledveikus neimus arevus yedidus chavivus chashikus mesikus ad klois nafsha mehem. And he goes on and on. In any case, so we're talking about a very, very high madrega of dveikus, of cleaving to the Creator. Yeah. So, but it nevertheless was a chait. And about this comes the azhara of al yovei b'choleis al hakodesh. Yeah, there's order. There are halachas, when you can, when you can't, what you can, what you can't. So, in other words, non-halachic approaches to the divine are unacceptable. And Parshas Acharei Mos teaches us not to follow the spirit. The halacha is what determines what's to be done and what's not to be done. In other words, here we're really saying that sometimes people are religious and not observant. It's so immediately after Parshas Acharei comes Parshas Kedoshim and tells us that true. I mean, the spirit of Nadav Avihu went beyond, and it was broke the boundaries, and it was the wrong thing. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that we should observe the halachas as robots. Yeah, within the Dvorei Asher Samti B'ficha, we have to develop and we have to preserve the Ruchi Asher Olecho. So religious experience is very important, but it needs to take place within the framework of halacha. So the limud of Acharei Mos, Shnei B'nei Aharon, and the limud of Kedoshim Tiyu are really two sides of the coin of Avodas Hashem. Okay, having said that, you know that in spite of the fact that in the Torah, Parshas Kedoshim appears right after Acharei Mos, but it wasn't the seder of the Amira of these Parshas. When was Parshas Acharei Mos said? So the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Samach Amud Aleph, brings a brisa. Amar Reb Levi, Shmoine Parshiyos Nemru B'Yom Shehukam B'Yam Mishkan. That on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day that the Mishkan was Hukam, 8 Parshas were said. Ve'eluhem Parshas Kohanim, Parshas Leviim. Parshas Kohanim is Amor. Parshas Leviim is the dinim of the Leviim, and Parshas Nosoi. The Parshas Tmeim, Parshas Shiluach Tmeim, Parshas Acharei Mos, Parshas Shesuya Yayin, Parshas Neiros, Parshas Poraduma. So Rashi explains that all these things were necessary to be taught immediately on that day. Kahanim, Leviim, Tmeim. All this is relevant to the Avodas HaMishkan on the first day. Parshas Shesuya Yayin, Parshas Neiros, Parshas Poraduma, because there were those that carried Mishol El Tzafon, they carried the Nadav Avihu out of the Mikdash, they became Tmei Meis. We needed a Paraduma. But why in the world did the Parsha of Acharei Mos need to be taught? The content of Acharei Mos is Avodas Yom Kippurim, which is only going to happen 6 months later in Tishrei, and the Hakamas HaMishkan is on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Rashi says, Uparshas Acharei Mos, Afal Pi Shehi Shel Yom Kippurim, which l'chayre doesn't need to be said yet. Boy ba yoim nemra. Kediksiv Acharei Mos. That meaning it was said immediately Acharei Mos, which is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day of Hakamas HaMishkan. Umipnei shemeisu b'nei Aharon b'shvil bio shaloi letzorech. Since the b'nei Aharon died because they entered shaloi letzorech, Nemro oisa azhara laharon al yovei b'choleis. That's why the azhara that opens the parsha of Avodas Yom Kippurim, which is al yovei b'choleis al hakodesh, and bezois yovei Aaron was said by Bayoim. L'chayre, this connects with what Rashi brings from the Midrashim in the beginning of this week's parsha. Vayoim vayida b'Hashem al Moshe Acharei Moshe Shnei b'nei Aharon ma Talmud loymar, meaning, what's the emphasis of Acharei Moshe Shnei b'nei Aharon? Hoyer b'loza ben Azariah Moshe loy moshel l'choyle shenichnas etzloi roifei oma loy al toich al tzoynein v'al tishkav batachav, because it's not good for you. But Bo Acher, another doctor, came and said, "V'ama loy al toich al tzoynein." Val tishkav b'tachav sheloi tamus kederech shemeis ploini. He gives him a example. I mean, I wouldn't say a live example, probably a dead example. Sheloi tamus kederech shemeis ploini. So Rashi says, "Zeh zir zoi yoisim in harishin." When you give him with this illustration, I mean, the guy gets shaken up. Lokach nemar acharei mois shnei bnei aharon vayom Hashem al Moshe daber al aharon achicha v'al yovoy shelo yomus kederech shemeisu bonav. So probably giving this example is much more powerful when it's b'shas ma'aseh. In other words, on the day that bnei Aharon died, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, tell Aharon that al yovoy b'chol eisal hakodesh shelo yomus kederech shemeis ploni, which is when it's a Meisei Mutal of Avad, it's much stronger. But Lefiza, it comes out that the entire parsha, which is about Avodas Yom Kippurim, was really not. It didn't need to be said now. It's just the Al Yovoy B'chol Eis El HaKodesh needed to be said now. But once we said Al Yovoy B'chol Eis El HaKodesh, so we think never. And in Mela we roll out the whole parsha of Avodas Yom Kippurim. It's a shtickle shver. I bechlal have a shaylim shot. I mean, the truth is that we need no apologies for why the Al Yovoy B'chol Eis El HaKodesh needs to be said now, because once the Mishkan is standing, the Al Yovoy B'chol Eis El HaKodesh kicks in immediately. And it needs to be taught. So what was Rashi B'chal apologizing for? Why was it said, even though it's about Yom Kippur? So Rashi said that it was said because the Bnei Aharon died for a B'yishalei L'tzorech. That's why he's telling him now. And if not for that reason, he wouldn't have to tell him now, just like the Parashas HaNeros has to be said now, because the Neiros have to be lit now, then the Val Yovei B'chol Eis El HaKodesh has to be said now. So this is a shaylim pshat. I don't understand what Rashi in Gittin is saying, and v'tzorchian. But be'ikr is tzorchian that lefizeh the whole parsha is coming on the heels of the azhara of Al Yovoy B'chol Eis El HaKodesh. But the ganze parsha really doesn't need to be said now. So it would be possible to say, that in Vayikra Rabbah, Parsha Chaf Aleph, Piskei Zayin, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu was mitzvah ma'oid about the fact that Aaron will not be able to enter B'chol Eis El HaKodesh, and he said, Oili, Shema Nitchaf Aaron Ochi Mimchitzasoi. Maybe Aaron was pushed out of his mechitza. Well, Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No. Like a shem she'ata savur. It's not the way you think. And the Medrash goes into the whole arichas. Elo. B'chol shor shehu roitze likones. Yikones. Whenever Aaron will want to enter the Holy of Holies, he can. Rak she'yikones baseder hazeh. He has to bring all the karbanos, all the Yom Kippur karbanos, but he can do that any day of the year. So it comes out that Bezois Yovei Aaron Al HaKodesh means with the Seder Avodah that was given as a chiyuv on Yom Kippur. But whenever he wants, he could come in with this Seder. It's a pella because we don't find this concept anywhere in Shas. So the Mogen Avraham in the Hagor Zayis Ranon to the Yalkut Shimoini in Remes Tez Zayin writes B'zeh Haloshin B'chol Eis Shehu Roitze Aaron Ba'atzmoi. Aaron himself had this din that b'choleis he was allowed to if he does baseda hazeh b'zois yovoy. Mashenke shar kohen gadol, and so brings the Radal in his Pirush to Medrash Rabbah, and he in the name of the Goyen he writes Pirush Hagrozal ba'Aaron levadoy hoyozeh shebechol shor sherotza lichnois yikones rak shebaseda hazeh aval bonov nemar. Legabi Bnei Aharon, Legabi Zer Aharon, it says in the end of the parasha, Chukas Oilam V'goyme Achas Bashona, B'yom Kippurim Levada. And you must know that in the end of the Chochmas Sodom, in the end of Hilchas Avelos, he brings that he heard in the name of his Mechutin, Hagoyin HaChosid, Moreni Rebelio, and he has a ganze shtickle Torah to be Miyashiv, the Seder HaMikrois, according to this Yisoid. In any case, this is the shita of this medrash. So the Fizeh is poshut that the ganze parsha of Avodas Yom Kippurim had to be said immediately, because it's not just for Yom Kippur. It's something that Aaron could do tomorrow. If he wants to bring all these karbonis, he actually could enter the mikdash. Yes, so it's immediately relevant that bezois yavai Aaron al hakodesh if he does the seder Avodas Yom Kippurim. But it seems like there's a machlokes in Chazal about this, because in the Midrash HaGodel, which is quoted in the Torah Shlema, it says on this pasuk, "Bezois Yavoi v'goymer Yochol Eimesai Sheyitze Yavoi b'Seder Hazeh." You might think that whenever he wants, he can come with this seder. In other words, bring all these karbonis any day of the year. Talmud Loimar Dovar Lamud Misoifoi. You could learn from the end of the parasha, from pasuk Lamed Daled, where it says, "V'hoisa zois lochem lechukas olam goyim mikol chatei seichem achas bashana unichnes ve'eina nichnes b'chol eis sheyirtze." So the achas bashana really qualifies the bezois yavai Aaron al hakodesh from the tchilas haparsha. So there is no difference according to this midrash between Aaron and Bnei Aaron. The achas bashana that says at the end of the parsha is mefarish the bezois yavai Aaron, and he could only do it. Aaron himself could only do it on Yom Kippur, and vice versa. That Rashi is following this opinion, and that's why Rashi bends over backwards to explain why this parasha has to be said. Because if a Aaron would be able to do the avodah now, then Rashi wouldn't have to apologize. But Rashi is following the sheets of the Medrash HaGodel, and therefore he says what he says. But it leaves us wondering why it is that the entire parasha of Avodas Yom Kippurim was said now just because he had to be told Va'al Yavai B'chol Eis al HaKodesh. I want to suggest another mahalach that we say in the Haggadah, Ubana Lonu, it's Beis HaBechira Lechaper al Kol Avonoseinu. So you see that Mi'ikar Ha'inyan of the binyan Beis HaBechira, the binyan of the Mishkan, the binyan of the Mikdash, is Kaporas Avonos. That's the Ikar Inyan of the Mikdash. That's a Mechaper. No, but only on Bayoim Hazeh is Yitair Eschem Lechaper al Kol Avonoseichem. So it comes out that only on the Achas Bashana, the Ikir Tachlis, the full Tachlis of the Beis HaMikdash is Niskayim. The Ramchal was maimed the entire Sefer, Mesilas Yesharim, on the ladder of Reb Pinchas ben Yor, and he goes into every step and he explains it at length. But before he begins, he writes already in the Hagdama, he brings the whole ladder. He brings all the stages, all the steps, until the top. L'chara, he writes mefurish that one has to progress lefi ha'hadroge ha'mitztareches. One cannot skip a step. You have to go step by step. So why does he need to tell us tell us the whole ladder in the Hagdama? He should just tell us one thing at a time. He should tell us about Zahirus, and he should tell us about Zrizis. He should tell us about the next step. Why do we have to know now where the top of the ladder is? So obviously it seems that in spite of the fact that one needs to progress one step at a time, but from the beginning, a person has to know where he's going. What is the tachlis? A person has to set goals for himself. So also in the Mishkan, on the first day, we are being told that we should realize how far this project goes. In other words, it's l'chaper al avoneseinu, and it reaches the madrega of biz Yom Kippur, where it's vayom hazeh yitar eschem l'chaper al kol avoneseichem. So we're taught on the first day where this is going, how far this can reach, because that gives us a different level of appreciation for even the smaller steps. That's even more. If you look in the beginning of the Mesilas Yesharim, he says, Yesoida Chasidus, V'shoresh ha'avoda atmimahu, sheyizbarer v'yisameis eitzel ha'adam ma choivosoi boy lamoi ulema tzorich sheyosim mabotoi umagamosoi b'chol asher omel kol yimei chayev. What is his obligation in life, and what should he be mabotoi umagamosoi? What should he be looking forward to? What should he be wanting to do in everything that he's omel kol yimei chayev? L'chara, it's a yituloshin because, I mean, l'chara, a person should have his mabotoi and his magamosoi. He should have his focus and his aspiration to fulfill his obligation. So it's why is he saying as if a person should be putting his mabotay or magamosay on something which is beyond his obligation. Is that the case? But you know that the Sefer Mesilas Yesharim is based on the Sulam of the Pinchas Ben Yair. Now the top madregis of this Sulam are Kedusha, Ruach HaKodesh, and Tchias HaMeis. Already in Perek Chavav he says, Inyan HaKedusha Kofulu. The Inyan of Kedusha is Koful, it's double, the Hainu. Tchilosay Avoide, V'soifoi Gmul. The beginning of Kedusha is effort, is Avoide. But the Soif Madregis HaKedusha is Gmul, it's already reward. Tchilosay Hishtadlus, V'soifoi Matone. And he's married. So now, since the tachlis of the Madregis HaKedusha, the Kedoshim Tiyu of this week's parsha, is not something that a person could attain and he could achieve, because it's only a matana. It's only a matana. So you can't say that it's part of my obligation to achieve that, because I can't achieve it. And all the more so when it comes to the next Madrega, Ruach HaKodesh, the next Madrega, Tchias HaMeisim. I mean, that's all in the realm of Gmul for those that try hard enough until they get there. But you can't say that a person is obliged to acquire Ruach HaKodesh. A person is obliged to acquire the ability to be a Mechayim Mason. So I think it's these madregis about which the Ramchal is saying it's not part of the Choyves Adam Ba'ilomoi, but it's Lamat Sorich Sheyosim Mabotei or Magamosoi. A person has to know that even from the first steps, this is how far it can go. And this is where he could reach, even though it's not within his obligation in terms of Choyvosei Shel Adam Ba'ilomoi, but it's where he should be looking out. It's where he should be Yosim Mabotoi Umagamosoi. So you see, it's not enough for a person to know what his obligation is, but he has to know where all this ought to bring him. That's the reason that he right away tells us the entire ladder, because a person has to know from the beginning how far this is meant to go. And Memela, the pshat is that in the Akamas HaMishkan on the first day, we're told about the avodah of Yom Kippurim, even though it's on the Yom, it's only in the Chodesh Hashvi, because the Achas Bashana is the spitz, is the epitome, is the top of where the Mikdash brings us. And Memela, we need to know that from the beginning, and every Yid has to know. Chayiv Kol Adam Loima, Mosai Yagiu Masai Lamaise Avoisai. Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, even though Avada we know Ha'avos Hein Amerikova, and you can't say that I'm obliged to be like the others. I mean, you can't say that that's part of my obligation. But nevertheless, I should be saying Masai Yagiu Masai L'Masai Avoisai, which will enhance my whole Seder Avoida. And we should all be Zoiche to set higher goals. Rabbi Say, having said all that,